What if being born a bastard was the best thing that ever happened to you? On April 15th, 1452, a baby entered the world with no name, no inheritance, and no idea he would become history's most celebrated artist. Picture the scene: a warm spring evening in rural Tuscany. The smell of olive oil and wood smoke hung in the air. His mother, Caterina, a young peasant woman, held him in a small hamlet called Anciano. She named him Leonardo, just Leonardo. His father, a respected Florentine notary who would acknowledge the child but never marry his mother. But here's the thing about closed doors: sometimes they become windows to somewhere else entirely. In Renaissance Italy, legitimacy meant everything. It was not merely a legal status but a complete definition of what a person could become. Legitimate sons inherited their father's professions, their social standing, their place in the carefully ordered hierarchy of Florentine society. Think about what that meant for a bastard child. They received formal education in Latin, the language of law, medicine, and the church. They joined guilds that had regulated trades for centuries, married into families that had known their families for generations, and carried forward names that stood like pillars in the architecture of social order. For an illegitimate child, these doors were firmly closed, locked with chains forged from centuries of convention. What was young Leonardo supposed to do with his life? The circumstances of his birth remain partially mysterious even today. His mother Caterina's exact identity has been debated by scholars for centuries. She was likely Caterina di Meolippi, a young peasant woman from the area around Vinci, though some accounts suggest she may have been a slave from the Middle East, brought to Tuscany through the Mediterranean trade routes that connected Renaissance Italy to distant lands. Whatever her origins, she was not a woman Ser Piero could marry without destroying his professional reputation. The social gulf between a notary and a peasant woman was unbridgeable in 15th century Tuscany. Their son would carry the consequences of that gulf for the rest of his life. Ser Piero came from a family of notaries stretching back 5 generations. His father and grandfather had practiced the profession before him. His sons, by legitimate marriages, would practice it after. The notary's work was essential to Renaissance society: drafting contracts, witnessing wills, recording property transactions, maintaining the legal documentation that held civilization together. It required Latin fluency, formal education, guild membership, and above all, respectability. An illegitimate son could not become a notary. The law explicitly forbade it. So when Ser Piero acknowledged his bastard son but did not bring him into the family profession, he was not being cruel. He was simply recognizing reality. Leonardo could not follow the path his legitimate half-brothers would walk. He would need to find another way. Imagine being 5 years old, living with your mother in rural Anciano, with no idea what your future holds. For his first 5 years, young Leonardo lived with his mother, experiencing the rhythms of agricultural life in intimate detail. This was not the refined world of Florentine palaces or the busy workshops of urban craftsmen. This was the countryside, where peasants rose before dawn to tend fields and livestock, where the cycle of seasons determined every aspect of existence, where a child could wander freely among olive groves and vineyards with no scheduled lessons or predetermined expectations. Leonardo watched seasons change across Tuscan hillsides. He observed birds soaring on thermal currents rising from sun-heated valleys. He studied the way water flowed through irrigation channels carved by generations of farmers. Sound familiar? That restless curiosity, that need to understand how things work. He saw how plants grew toward light, how animals moved across terrain, how storms gathered over distant mountains before sweeping across the landscape. These early years of immersion in the natural world planted seeds that would blossom throughout his life. His curiosity about how things worked, why they moved, what made them beautiful began not in a workshop but in these fields and forests, where a child with no prescribed future could simply wonder. There were no Latin lessons for young Leonardo, no primers on classical philosophy, no tutors drilling him in the categories and hierarchies that organized medieval knowledge. Here's what you need to understand. This apparent disadvantage became his liberation. Instead of learning through ancient texts, there was direct observation of nature, unfiltered by theories about what nature was supposed to be. This would prove revolutionary. While educated men of his era approached the world through texts written centuries earlier, Leonardo would approach it through his own eyes, trusting what he saw over what authorities claimed. Then, around 1457, Leonardo's life changed dramatically. He moved to his father's household in the town of Vinci, joining his grandfather Antonio, his uncle Francesco, and his father's young wife Albiera, who showed the 5-year-old affection and warmth despite his irregular status. Ser Piero had married Albiera di Giovanni Amadori when Leonardo was still an infant, and though she bore no children of her own, she treated her husband's bastard son with kindness. She died young, before Leonardo reached adolescence, but her warmth may have helped ease his transition from peasant hamlet to notary's household. Despite his irregular birth, Leonardo received treatment as a legitimate son within the household. He was given education in reading, writing, and arithmetic, the fundamental skills that any child of respectable family needed. He learned to read Tuscan Italian, to write in the flowing script of the era, to calculate the figures necessary for commerce and daily life. But here was the crucial omission that would prove transformative. He did not learn Latin. Why did this matter so much? Latin was the language of everything that mattered in Renaissance intellectual life: law, medicine, theology, philosophy. The classical texts being rediscovered and celebrated throughout Italy. All were written in Latin. University education was conducted entirely in Latin. Any young man aspiring to professional status needed fluency in the ancient tongue. But Latin also carried limitations that Leonardo would never acquire. It came with deference to authority, with the assumption that ancient writers had already discovered everything worth knowing, with categorical thinking that divided knowledge into rigid domains. Medieval and Renaissance education taught students to argue from precedent, to cite Aristotle and Galen and Ptolemy as final authorities on their respective subjects. To question these authorities was not merely wrong but unthinkable. Leonardo never learned this deference. Without Latin, he could not read the ancient authorities. Without reading them, he could not learn to worship them. He would spend his life investigating nature directly, trusting his own observations over received wisdom, conducting experiments to test theories rather than accepting them because famous men had pronounced them true. Had Leonardo been legitimate, he would have followed his father and his father's father into the notary profession, spending decades copying contracts and wills in the language of legal precision. The Vinci family had practiced notary work for 5 generations. It was secure, respectable, utterly conventional, and utterly close to him. The profession excluded illegitimate sons by law and custom, and no amount of talent could overcome this barrier. What do you do when traditional paths are blocked? You forge new ones. Leonardo recorded only 2 childhood memories in his later notebooks, and both reveal the essence of the man he would become. But their first was a dream or fantasy about a kite, a large bird that dropped from the sky and hovered over his cradle, its tail feathers brushing against his lips. He interpreted this as an omen, a sign of his destiny connected to flight and the mastery of air. Whether the memory was real or constructed, whether it happened exactly as he recalled or represented a later fantasy projected backwards into infancy, Leonardo found meaning in it throughout his life, as if nature itself had marked him for a special purpose. Picture this, decades later. He would spend years sketching flying machines, studying bird wings with scientific precision, writing more than 35,000 words about aeronautics. He would design ornithopters with 33-foot wingspans, aerial screws that anticipated helicopters, and gliding mechanisms that understood principles the Wright brothers would rediscover 4 centuries later. The bird hovering over his cradle became a symbol of ambitions that transcended his era. The second memory occurred during mountain exploration when the young Leonardo discovered a dark cave in the Tuscan hills. Standing at its entrance, he felt 2 emotions simultaneously: overwhelming fear and overwhelming curiosity. The darkness terrified him. He did not know what lurked within. Wild animals, bandits, demons, the terrors that populated medieval imagination. All might wait in that blackness. But what happened next defined his entire life. The desire to understand, to see what others had not seen, to know what lay hidden proved stronger than his terror. He bent down. He entered the cave. This dual nature of curiosity would define Leonardo's entire career. The fear of the unknown conquered by an even greater hunger for knowledge. Whether dissecting corpses by candlelight in cold morgues, sketching flying machines that defied the understanding of his era, spending 16 years perfecting a single portrait, or designing war machines for princes he hoped would never use them. Leonardo approached every challenge as he had approached that cave, trembling with fear and burning with the need to know. Around 1466, when Leonardo was approximately 14 years old, his father made a fateful decision that would shape the course of art history. Ser Piero had seen his son's drawings and recognized unusual talent, the kind of ability that marked a young person for artistic rather than commercial pursuits. Since the notary profession was closed to Leonardo anyway, why not channel his abilities towards something productive? He approached Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's most accomplished artists, and arranged for his illegitimate son to enter the workshop as an apprentice. Imagine entering Verrocchio's workshop for the first time as a 14-year-old boy from rural Tuscany. The smell of oil paint and metal filings filled the air. The sound of hammers striking bronze echoed from one corner while apprentices ground pigments at long wooden tables. Master craftsmen debated perspective and proportion in rapid Florentine dialect, gesturing at drawings pinned to walls. Sculptures in various stages of completion stood on pedestals while paintings dried on easels. Young Leonardo had never seen anything like it. This was no mere painting studio. This was a polytechnic academy where art, science, and engineering merged into a single pursuit of understanding and creation. Verrocchio, born Andrea di Ciani, was both a preeminent sculptor and painter whose workshop stood at the epicenter of Florentine artistic excellence during the Renaissance's golden age. He was a master of multiple disciplines, creating bronze sculptures that still amaze viewers today, paintings that defined the Florentine style, and decorative objects for wealthy patrons throughout Italy. His workshop received commissions from the Medici family, the most powerful patrons in Florence, and from churches and guilds across the region. To enter Verrocchio's workshop was to enter the heart of Renaissance creativity. Here, Leonardo became a garzone, a studio boy, beginning at the very bottom of the workshop hierarchy. For years, he would sweep floors, run errands, grind pigments into fine powders, prepare wood panels with layers of gesso, and watch, always watching. Every task, no matter how menial, taught something about the craft. Grinding pigments taught the chemistry of colors. Preparing panels taught the properties of wood and binding agents. Sweeping floors kept the workshop clean but also allowed a curious boy to observe master craftsmen at work, absorbing their techniques, their problem-solving methods, their approaches to challenges that arose in every project. You've seen this model before, even if you didn't recognize it. The training Leonardo received was comprehensive beyond anything we might imagine for an art education today. Modern art schools teach drawing and painting, perhaps sculpture and printmaking, organized into separate courses with distinct curricula. Verrocchio's workshop taught everything at once, integrated into actual projects rather than abstract exercises. Leonardo learned drafting and drawing, the fundamental skills upon which everything else would build. He practiced with silverpoint, a demanding medium where a metal stylus leaves marks on specially prepared paper that cannot be erased. Every line had to be right the first time. This discipline trained his hand and eye to work together with precision that would later allow him to capture anatomical details invisible to less rigorous observers. He mastered chemistry, understanding how to mix pigments that would last for centuries without fading, how to prepare surfaces that would accept paint without cracking, how to create varnishes that protected finished works from humidity and time. The chemistry of art was not separate from the art itself, but essential to its creation and survival. A beautiful painting that flaked off the wall within a decade was a failure, no matter how brilliant its conception. He studied metallurgy, essential for bronze casting and the creation of sculptural works that defined Renaissance prestige. Verrocchio's workshop created bronze sculptures through the lost wax casting process, a complex technique requiring knowledge of metal behavior at different temperatures, the properties of various alloys, the engineering of armatures and supports. Leonardo absorbed this metallurgical knowledge, which would later inform his designs for cannons, bells, and the massive bronze horse he planned but never completed for the Duke of Milan. He learned mechanics and carpentry, building the scaffolding and apparatus necessary for large-scale projects. When a workshop received a commission for a ceiling fresco or a monumental sculpture, someone had to design and construct the platforms that allowed artists to work safely at height. Someone had to engineer the hoists that lifted heavy bronze sections into place. This practical engineering was not beneath the Renaissance artist but integral to the work. He practiced metalworking, plaster casting, leather working, and woodwork. He developed skills in drawing, painting, and sculpture, the three visual arts that would make Renaissance Florence famous throughout history. He learned the emerging technique of oil painting, arriving from the Netherlands through trade routes and artistic exchanges, that would revolutionize how artists captured light and atmosphere. He studied traditional egg tempera, the medium that had dominated Italian painting for centuries. He learned fresco technique for wall painting, applying pigment to wet plaster in sections that had to be completed before the plaster dried. But perhaps most importantly, Leonardo absorbed ways of thinking that no university could have taught. The Verrocchio workshop practiced problem solving through experimentation. When a technique did not work, you tried another. When a project presented unprecedented challenges, you invented solutions. This was not book learning but practical intelligence, the kind that builds bridges and creates machines, that solves problems authorities said were unsolvable because the authorities had never actually tried. Think about it from a modern perspective. How many innovators succeed precisely because they approach problems from outside traditional disciplines? Leonardo also worked in the adjacent workshop of Antonio Poliolo, broadening his practical knowledge across multiple artistic disciplines. Poliolo was known for his anatomical accuracy, his depictions of the human body in violent action that required understanding of muscle and bone. Exposure to this workshop expanded Leonardo's growing interest in anatomy, the underlying structures that made bodies move. Florence itself provided the perfect intellectual climate for a mind like Leonardo's. This was the capital of the early Renaissance, a cauldron of creativity where new ideas fermented in taverns and palaces alike. The Medici family patronized artists and scholars with unprecedented generosity, creating an environment where talent could flourish regardless of social origin. Humanist philosophy was being refined in academies where ancient texts were read not as sacred scripture, but as starting points for new thinking. Manuscripts lost for 1,000 years were being rediscovered, translated, debated. The very concept of individual genius was emerging from medieval traditions of anonymous collective craft. This was the world that shaped Leonardo's mind, not the rigid hierarchies of university education with its Latin texts and theological certainties, but the practical, experimental, hands-on environment of the workshop. Here, a question was answered not by consulting authorities, but by building something and seeing if it worked. Here, failure was not shameful but instructive, a step toward eventual success. Here, the boundaries between art and engineering, between beauty and function, between creative vision and practical skill were blurred into irrelevance. By 1472, at age 20, Leonardo achieved a significant milestone: acceptance into Florence's Painters' Guild, the Guild of St. Luke. He had attained master status. The illegitimate boy from Vinci who could not become a notary had become something far more remarkable: a recognized artist in one of Europe's greatest cultural centers, certified by the guild system that regulated Florentine crafts. But here's where Leonardo's character reveals itself most clearly. Having achieved master status, having earned the right to establish his own independent workshop and take his own commissions, Leonardo chose to remain in Verrocchio's studio for 5 additional years. Most young artists, hungry for fame and profit and independence, would have rushed to establish themselves. Leonardo stayed. Why? Perhaps he understood that mastery was not a destination but a process, not a certificate but a practice. Perhaps he recognized that Verrocchio's workshop still offered learning opportunities unavailable anywhere else, including access to major commissions that required collaborative execution. Perhaps he simply loved the collaborative environment, the daily exchange of ideas, the stimulation of working alongside other brilliant minds on challenges that pushed everyone's abilities. Whatever his reasons, Leonardo demonstrated patience that would become both his greatest strength and his most frustrating weakness throughout his career. The willingness to spend years perfecting what others would have declared finished. His earliest documented work dates to August 5th, 1473, a pen and ink drawing of the Arno Valley, revealing his keen observational skills and technical precision even as a young artist. The drawing shows landscape rendered with scientific accuracy, every contour of the land captured through careful looking rather than conventional formulas for depicting terrain. Here was evidence that Leonardo approached art differently, using drawing not merely to create beautiful images, but to investigate and record the world, to understand through seeing. Then came the moment that would become legend, the story that every student of art history learns. Between 1472 and 1475, Leonardo collaborated with Verrocchio on a painting called The Baptism of Christ. Verrocchio painted most of the work himself, including the central figures of Christ and John the Baptist, using the techniques and conventions he had mastered over decades of successful practice. But he assigned his star pupil to paint one of the angels kneeling at the scene's edge, holding Jesus's robe in delicate hands. What happened next changed the course of art history. According to Giorgio Vasari, the Renaissance biographer who recorded artists' lives a generation later, Leonardo painted his angel with such superior skill that Verrocchio, witnessing his student's surpassing talent, put down his brush and never painted again. The older master recognized that his apprentice had eclipsed him. The workshop that had trained Leonardo could no longer teach him anything. The student had become the master. The story may be embellished, the details exaggerated for dramatic effect, as Vasari was prone to do. But the painting survives in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and anyone who looks can see the difference. Leonardo's angel glows with a luminosity, a three-dimensional presence, a subtle turn of the head and softness of expression that the surrounding figures lack. The angel seems to exist in real space while the other figures remain flat, bound to their painted surface. Something had changed in the history of Western art. What made Leonardo's angel different? He had begun using techniques that would later be named sfumato, the smoky, seamless blending of tones that modeled form through light and shadow rather than line. He had observed how light actually behaved, how edges were never truly sharp but always slightly blurred by atmosphere, how colors shifted across surfaces in gradients too subtle for conventional painting to capture. He brought this observation to his brushwork, building up thin glazes of oil paint that created depth and atmosphere unknown in tempera painting. But in 1476, at age 24, scandal struck. An anonymous denunciation was dropped in the tamburo, a bronze drum at the Palazzo della Signoria where Florentines could secretly report crimes. The accusation charged Leonardo and 3 other young men with sodomy involving Jacopo Saltarelli, a young goldsmith who worked nearby. Such accusations carried severe penalties in Renaissance Florence. The city had established the officers of the night specifically to investigate and prosecute sodomy, and the penalties could include fines, imprisonment, exile, or even death. Leonardo was arrested. He appeared before the officers of the night, his career and possibly his life hanging in the balance. The charges were ultimately dismissed on a technicality. Accusations required signatures to proceed, and no one came forward to sign their names to the denunciation. But Leonardo was arrested twice for the same offense before the matter was dropped. Someone clearly wanted him destroyed. After the scandal, Leonardo vanished from Florence for 2 years, disappearing from historical records entirely. When he reappeared in 1478, he had established himself as an independent master with prestigious commissions, including an altarpiece for the Chapel of St. Bernard in the Palazzo Vecchio. What happened during those 2 years? Where did Leonardo go? These questions have never been answered. Some scholars speculate he traveled, perhaps to Milan or even beyond Italy. Others suggest he simply worked quietly, waiting for the scandal to fade from public memory. But the scandal added another layer to his outsider status. Already marked as illegitimate from birth, already denied traditional career paths by law and custom. Now Leonardo carried the stain of sexual accusation. In a society where reputation determined opportunity, where family connections and social standing governed every transaction, Leonardo had accumulated strikes against him that would have destroyed lesser men. Instead, these marginalizations set him free. Here's what you need to understand about outsiders and innovation. How many great innovators succeeded precisely because they approached problems from outside traditional disciplines? Steve Jobs dropped out of college. Bill Gates left Harvard. Countless tech founders lacked formal credentials in the fields they revolutionized. The outsider sees what the insider cannot, questioning assumptions so deeply embedded that insiders do not even recognize them as assumptions. The person with nothing to lose takes risks the establishment cannot afford. Leonardo's illegitimacy meant he never received formal Latin education, so he was never trained to defer to ancient authorities who claimed complete knowledge of subjects they had barely investigated. His exclusion from the notary profession meant he never learned to think in rigid legal categories, never absorbed the lawyer's instinct to fit new situations into old precedents. His scandal meant he could not pursue conventional respectability, so he did not waste energy trying to appear respectable. Free from the constraints that bound legitimate sons to family professions and social expectations, he could pursue knowledge wherever curiosity led. Around 1477, Leonardo finally established his own independent workshop in Florence. The results were, by conventional measures, disastrous. He received only 3 commissions over the next several years. 2 were never finished. 1 was never started. His workshop was a commercial failure by any reasonable standard. The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned by Augustinian monks in July 1481 with a 30-month deadline, was abandoned that September when Leonardo departed for Milan. The massive panel, nearly 8 feet square and his largest surviving work, remains suspended at the preliminary stage. Charcoal sketches establish the composition. Watercolor ink washes suggest shadows and atmosphere. Oil paint begins to define certain figures while others remain ghostly outlines. The central Virgin and Child emerge in detail while background figures dissolve into suggestions. The painting freezes Leonardo's process at a moment of transition. Revolutionary in conception, but incomplete in execution. The monks eventually hired Filippino Lippi to paint a replacement altarpiece, which was completed in 1496, 15 years after they had first commissioned Leonardo. They had learned what many patrons would learn. Hiring Leonardo meant accepting that brilliance came without guarantees of completion. The pattern that would define his career had emerged. Brilliant beginnings, revolutionary vision, technical innovation beyond anything his contemporaries could match, and then abandonment. The same restless curiosity that made Leonardo extraordinary made him unreliable. His mind leaped from painting to anatomy to engineering to architecture before any single project could reach completion. Each new interest was more fascinating than the last. Each new question demanded answers more urgently than old commissions demanded completion. But here is where Leonardo's genius for self-reinvention revealed itself. In 1482, the 30-year-old artist wrote what may be history's most audacious cover letter, seeking employment with Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan. Leonardo did not lead with his paintings. He did not mention the luminous angel in Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ. He did not describe his revolutionary sfumato technique or his vision for transforming Italian art. He did not even mention the prestigious commissions he had received, perhaps wisely, given that none had been completed. Instead, he opened with military engineering. "Most illustrious Lord," he wrote, "having now sufficiently considered the specimens of all those who proclaim themselves skilled contrivers of instruments of war," he then listed 10 specific capabilities he could provide. Portable bridges for advancing armies that could be carried and deployed in the field. Methods to drain trenches during sieges through hydraulic engineering. Techniques for destroying fortified positions built on rock. Mortars designed for psychological warfare that could fling small stones almost resembling a storm. Armored vehicles safe and unattackable that anticipated tanks by 4 centuries. Secret underground tunnels for siege warfare. Covered chariots impervious to enemy fire. Catapults and siege weapons improved from ancient designs. Only in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, did Leonardo mention he could also paint whatever may be done and sculpt in marble, bronze, and clay. The massive bronze horse monument for the Duke's father received brief mention. Painting barely warranted a sentence. What was at stake in this bold gambit? This was not modesty. This was strategic brilliance. Leonardo understood that Milan did not need another court painter. The city was threatened by rivals, engaged in constant low-level conflict with neighboring states, needing military advantages more than artistic decoration. The Duke needed an engineer who could build fortifications, design weapons, and manage water systems. That such an engineer could also create beauty was a pleasant bonus, not the primary value proposition. Leonardo was reinventing himself to match the market. The failed Florentine artist became Leonardo the military technologist, Leonardo the hydraulic engineer, Leonardo the universal genius who could solve any problem the Duke might face. He packaged himself not as who he had been but as who Milan needed him to become. The strategy worked. Leonardo secured the position as painter and engineer of the Duke, a role extending far beyond art into architecture, military fortifications, and hydraulic engineering. His 17 years in Milan would prove the most productive period of his career. He would paint the Last Supper, design stage sets for court festivals, plan an equestrian monument, and fill notebooks with observations about everything from water flow to human flight. He would still struggle to complete major works, still follow his curiosity across disciplines rather than focusing on any single pursuit. But he had found a patron who valued his range rather than demanding specialization. What Verrocchio's workshop had given Leonardo was not just artistic training but the intellectual foundation for polymathic genius. The workshop model of learning, where students mastered multiple disciplines through hands-on practice under expert guidance, where knowledge was integrated rather than compartmentalized, created minds capable of synthesis that university education with its rigid categories could not produce. You've probably noticed this pattern in modern innovation. Today's most innovative programs recognize this. Coding bootcamps emphasize practical skills over theory. Teaching by doing rather than by reading. STEAM education bridges science and art, recognizing that creativity drives innovation in every field. Maker movements revive apprenticeship learning for the digital age, building communities where people learn by building things together. The model that trained Leonardo 5 centuries ago remains relevant because it addresses fundamental truths about how humans learn best. The illegitimate boy from Vinci never became a notary. He never received formal education in Latin or joined the respectable professions his father's family had practiced for generations. Instead, he became Leonardo da Vinci, the name that now embodies universal genius, the Renaissance man against whom all polymaths are measured, the artist, scientist, engineer whose notebooks reveal a mind 5 centuries ahead of its time. And it started because he was born an outsider. Had he been legitimate? Had he received the proper education? Had he followed the expected path? He might have spent his life copying contracts in a Florence office, his genius forever dormant, never awakened by the challenges that forced him to forge his own way. The constraints that appeared to limit him became the conditions that liberated him. The doors that closed pushed him through windows no one else had noticed. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is the best thing that could ever happen. Sometimes exclusion from the expected path leads to territories no one expected you to discover. Sometimes being marked as different from birth gives you permission to see differently for life. On April 15th, 1452, a baby was born who would change civilization. His first act of rebellion was simply existing as someone the world did not expect or want. Everything that followed, the paintings that revolutionized art, the inventions that anticipated the modern world, the anatomical discoveries that advanced medicine by generations, the notebooks that contain ideas we are still exploring 5 centuries later. All of it grew from that original marginality, that foundational exclusion that became his greatest gift. The outsider's gift was freedom, and Leonardo used it to reimagine what humans could achieve. He never forgot where he came from. In his notebooks, written backwards in mirror script that scholars still debate, he signed himself simply Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo from Vinci. The name was not a surname in the modern sense but a reminder of origins, a statement of identity that acknowledged his birthplace rather than claiming a family lineage he was never granted. The illegitimate son had no family name to inherit, so he made his first name legendary instead. And in that name, Leonardo, now stands for something the rigid hierarchies of Renaissance Italy could never have imagined: the possibility that genius can emerge from anywhere, that constraints can become catalysts, that the person born furthest from power might see most clearly how to transform the world. The workshop that trained him no longer exists. Verrocchio's studio closed generations ago, its location now occupied by modern Florence buildings. But the model of education it represented, the integration of art and science and engineering, theory and practice working together, individual talent nurtured within collaborative environment. This model persists wherever humans gather to learn by doing, to question by building, to understand by creating. And at the center of that legacy stands Leonardo, the outsider who became the ultimate insider, the bastard who became the benchmark of genius, the child born without a proper name who made his name immortal. What if being born a bastard was the best thing that ever happened to you? For Leonardo da Vinci, it was.